Good evening everybody and welcome to this final Profs in the PAV. It's not that we're stopping doing these events, it's just this will be the final one in this building before we move to the Catalyst. I think Fiona's going to say a bit more about that. Also, Fiona's in my bad books because she's put the name of the Icelandic volcano in my briefing, which will be referred to by me as the Icelandic volcano. I've got no chance.
Everybody else who's tried to pronounce it, I think.
So my name's Dr. Helen Paul. I'm Executive Dean in the School of Justice, Security and Sustainability, and I'm really honoured to be introducing Professor Fiona Tweed and Professor Ruth Swetnam this evening. Honestly, I do know them. And their talk is entitled Now You See It, Now You Don't, The Importance of Landscapes in a Changing World. So the focus tonight is about how do landscapes make us feel and why? Why do we find certain landscapes attractive? What makes us value one view above another? And how do we feel when those views change? Landscapes are experiencing huge changes, and listening rather depressingly to the proceedings in the UN today about climate change, we know about the impact of climate change, societal development and increasing urbanisation. Ruth and Fiona will share their research on the nature of our relationships with landscape and why it is important to assess and monitor landscape quality and landscape change in a rapidly evolving world. Ruth Swetnam is Professor of Applied Geography at Staffordshire University. Ruth is a Chartered Geographic Information Systems Specialist and has spent over 25 years working with digital maps and environmental data. She previously worked at the National Remote Sensing Centre, the NERC Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, as well as the Conservation Science Group at Cambridge University. Her research interests are wide-ranging and interdisciplinary in nature, but focus on historical land use change, species modelling, as well as digital mapping in all its forms. She was part of an international team evaluating the importance of Tanzania's rainforests, and her work formed part of Tanzania's submission to the United Nations COP meeting in Copenhagen in 2009. More recently, she led a wide-ranging assessment of the landscape quality of rural Wales for the Welsh Government and has contributed to national reviews of the impact of forestry on the beauty of the wider British landscape. So that's Ruth. Fiona Tweed is Professor of Physical Geography at Staffordshire University. Fiona's main research interests are glacial processes and natural hazards. She is an international expert on glacier outburst floods with over 25 years' experience of field research, chiefly in Iceland, where she has led many research expeditions. Fiona was part of a team investigating outburst flooding from the 2010 Icelandic volcano eruption. Go on then, Fiona. Thank you. See why I didn't have a go. And her work on the societal impacts of glacier floods is cited in the 2019 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. Fiona's research also focuses on risk and resilience, and she has led European Commission-funded research in these areas. Most recently, the focus of her work has shifted to examine some of the consequences of melting glaciers and landscape change. Fiona was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship by the Higher Education Academy in 2016. Okay, so over to you, ladies.
Thanks, Helen. Helen has introduced us. We'll say more about ourselves and our discipline in a moment. But firstly, we've called this talk Now You See It, Now You Don't, and that's a very purposeful thing. This first set of images illustrates that perfectly. We've got the Rhone Glacier. Well, on one of the images, we've got a very clear shot of the Rhone Glacier in 1900 on the left-hand side there. On the right-hand side, there's something very obvious missing. The Rhone Glacier hasn't completely melted, but it's no longer in our view. And what we're concerned with tonight is looking at the view and the changes in the view. And we'll get there eventually. You'll be able to see how we have evolved to work together. But first, Profs in the PAV. I gave the very first Profs in the PAV talk in March 2017. It was delivered in the cafe next door. I had an obstacle course to try to jump over the various tables and pillars and things in my way to deliver the talk. I think it's therefore quite fitting that I'm here to accompany my colleague and friend Ruth in delivering this last in the series of Profs in the PAV. Now, that first talk was entitled Breaking the Ice, and I think that sums up what we've been trying to do with this series. It's about engaging different people in the research that we do here at the university. Some of the veterans of our talk, some of the people that have come time and time and time again, may even recognise themselves in the photo at the bottom there. In terms of Profs in the PAV then, just a quick recap. We can't spotlight all of the talks that have been delivered, but these are some of the images that were kindly supplied by the events team. We've covered a diverse range of research and innovation through the 5 years that we've held these talks, from Trump, Russia and election crime through to healthy diets. We've had footwear and we've had crime. We've also had Profs at Dudley's down in Stafford, and that's one of the talks that was delivered there, Understanding the Human Spirit. There have been 26 talks, over 1,300 attendees, many more when we had to go online due to COVID. Now, we've said this is the last in the series. It's a series finale, if you like. However, the phoenix will emerge from the flames. In the Catalyst, in the next academic year, we're planning a whole new set of things. Maybe Catalyst collaborations. It could be conversations in the Catalyst. But I don't want the people that have come to Profs in the PAV to go away and think that's it. There will be lots more interesting research for you to engage with in the coming months. Having recapped there, we're going to tell you a bit about ourselves. So, Ruth.
Okay. So, as Helen very kindly introduced, I'm a Geographic Information Systems specialist, and I have actually spent a lot of my time as a geographer doing research in front of a computer screen, because I'm a digital mapper, and the type of thing that floats my boat are constructing interesting digital data from the real world and collaborating with people who do go out in the field a great deal. Geography is a very broad discipline, and so I spend huge amounts of time mapping. My research involves digital data. However, I am a geographer, and my research interests have always very much been in landscapes and how that digital data can best represent them. So I do get out in the field because it's very important not to see the world entirely through a computer screen. So I do a lot of digital mapping, I do public engagement, which is what we're doing today. I have a lot of students. This is me down in Cambridge talking to a student from Brazil about her data, and I will talk about some of the landscapes there in the meantime.
So I'm Fiona Tweed, I'm Professor of Physical Geography. I've been introduced. My research areas are basically in the cryosphere, the icy world, glacial processes, natural hazards. And the first three images there illustrate sort of really what I'm about. I'm a fieldwork geographer, so I get out into the field to collect data. But my research expertise directly influences and feeds into what is the constituents of my teaching here at the university. So students get to hear directly from me about my research. The other image at the bottom there alludes to something else that I do. We've both talked about research and teaching, but also that feeds into public engagement, yes, like this, but also into rather larger groups of people with whom I engage. That's the Apollo Victoria Theatre in Westminster, and I'm waiting to go on stage to 2,000 people. So a little bit different from doing this, but there's no less attention goes into this than doing that. So that's me, and that's what I'm about.
Okay, so we're going to essentially tell you a bit of a story tonight, because I first met Fiona in 2012 when I first arrived here at the university. And not long after I arrived, I got a research contract for the Welsh Government, and I was tasked with quite a difficult job. They wanted to assess the landscape quality of rural Wales. Now, I was part of a big research consortium. Research always happens in consortiums. And they knew I was a digital mapper and I'd got landscape background. And essentially, what we were doing was taking a stratified sample of the whole of Wales, 1 kilometre squares, 300 sites, and I was tasked with coming up with a method that could be objectively repeated across these 300 sites. So it's not something that we could go out and map individually. It had to be something that could be done in a repeatable manner. Because these are the sort of questions that arise when you think about, well, how beautiful is a landscape? What is it in the landscape that makes it beautiful to us? Do I see it in the same way that you see it? Do you see different things? So I had this job of creating a method. I did it in digital geographic computing systems, which could be repeated across these sites. Now, at this time, myself and Fiona were actually having very separate research experiences. Fiona was a new colleague. I knew she did loads of icy stuff. I was quite impressed because she spent a lot of time in Iceland. But I created this method for Wales. Fiona was very interested in what was going on, so I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Okay, so essentially what I did was I created this thing called the Visual Quality Index, and you're going to hear quite a bit about this tonight, the VQI for short. Now, before we go into great big arguments about you can't measure how beautiful a landscape is, that's a cracker's thing to do, I accept that completely. But there are certain things in the landscape that we know virtually every human being does like. And a lot of research has gone into this, so it wasn't just things I pulled out of the air. So we know, for example, that water is very important. Humans like water. We like to be near water, we like to hear it, we like to look at it. We also like to be near the coast, okay? So we love the seaside, particularly in a coastal area like Britain. So water we love, water's very important, and loads of evidence for that. We also like the landscape to go up and down quite a lot. We like mountains. That's very, very common, certainly in European contexts. We really like to see greenery. Trees are really important to most Europeans when you ask them. They're very big things in the landscape. They stick up. They're in the view. Woodlands are very important to us. We think they're beautiful generally, though not so much conifers. So there's lots of things, flowers, beautiful grasslands, variation. We like green things in the landscape. So we know these are very positive. We also are cultural beings. So there are many things in our landscape that we as people have created. So for example, the classic thing I always tell people, stone walls, okay? Stone walls are very important to many of us. They define lots of the British landscape. But they might be ancient monuments, they might be castles, they might be beautiful churches. There are many things that humans have built that we like. So all these things capture lots of things about the landscape, and we know that, and we can rate those positively in a place. There are also some things that humans build that we know we don't like looking at. The M6, for all its technical wonder, is not really generally beautiful. We don't like a lot of utilities, you know. There is a certain beauty in power stations, but not everybody digs that. Built environments, when it's very built, we tend not to like the look of those landscapes quite so much. So we've got lots of positive things, but we've got things that if we've got lots of, we don't like. So I'm not going to go into enormous detail about it. Essentially, we end up with a rating for a space. Now, when I first did this, it was being calculated from very detailed maps that had been informed by lots of detailed landscape field data. So there was loads and loads of other things that went into this. But essentially, the VQI gives you a rating between 0 and 1. It's just an index. It allows us to put landscapes in a rough order from, okay, these landscapes here tend to have not much of the things that we like looking at, whereas these landscapes over here have got lots of the sort of things in that we tend to find beautiful, and you know, so they're going to have a higher rating. So remember that that can be between 0 and 1. However, we can do it in the GIS like that, and that's what I did for 300 sites, huge amounts of data processing, but it was an objective method that could be compared across those sites. However, in reality, when you go out into the landscape, you have a very individual, personal response to it. And there are other things that we refer to as ephemera that will inform how you feel and rate a landscape. So, for example, odour, smells. If you smell sheep in the British Isles, you tend to know that you're in an upland area. You know, I'm sure you've all walked in places like that and you can smell the sheep and you think, yeah, I'm in the Staffordshire Moorlands or I'm in Wales. There may be some very persistent sounds. They may be natural and attractive, like the wind in the trees or the sound of a waterfall, or they may be deeply unpleasant, like standing next to the A500 on a Friday at 5 o'clock, very unpleasant. How you rate those things are very personal. And so we can also, when we do this in the field, we can include some of that. So just to be clear, there are two different approaches here. The original research from 2012 was very technical, digital, objective. I didn't go to 300 sites in Wales. It was all done using data that was fed in. As we progress that work, we can adapt that method and actually do it in person in the field. So we incorporate some of the technical side, but also incorporate these sort of more personal qualities. So we've got the combination of the qualitative and the quantitative. So what we got out of that was essentially for all those sites, many photographs, many things done, I essentially was able to organise these sites from 0 to 300 in terms of these are the really attractive ones, these are the not so attractive. And I was worried, I wanted to check this because as I've said to you, this is very personal, a lot of people's responses to it. So I did a big public preference survey with Welsh people and I showed them the photographs of the sites and said, do you like it? Give me a number out of 1 to 10. If you have to rate it, what would you give it? So 2,780 odd people responded. I was overwhelmed. People loved rating landscapes. And I tell you, I had a lot of chit-chat in the comments about why haven't you got Conwy Castle in there? It's really, really nice. Yeah, it's not typical Wales though, is it? And anyway, the result of that was that the order matched the VQI that I generated from the digital data. So that gave me confidence that I got basically the right things in it and it put it in an order that made sense to people. Okay, and it was published. So we'll just give you a quick talk through of some of the aspects of it.
Yes. Very quick, because we know we're up against time.
Yeah.
So there are, yes, we're racing through. There are key components of the visual quality index, as Ruth has pointed out. One of the most essential things, as we've said, is the terrain. What do we mean by terrain? How up and down it is, how rugged it is, how much bare rock you might be able to see, how much unevenness is in the landscape. So does anyone know where this is? Yes, good. Thought I'd do that. So we're going to show you this slide a few times, this image a few times with different things on it. So that image has some bare rock, some rugged terrain, and there are areas where there's no bare rock visible and it's gently undulating. So we'd have to look at that and go, well, what's the majority of that image? What score will we give it? The other thing that we mentioned that people identify with is the blue space. Now, by blue space, as Ruth has said, we mean running water or lakes, ponds, rivers, the coast. Again, in this image, that illustrates blue space as occupying less than 10% of the landscape view. So that's what we would record if we were looking at that view on the VQI. We'd look and we'd go, right, okay, less than 10% of that landscape is occupied by blue space.
So, the vegetation. As I said to you, the green space, particularly in a landscape like rural Wales and in Northern European landscapes generally, We are a vegetated landscape, and it's a very important part of it. So you can see in the same image here that the majority of the landscape view is covered in some kind of plant. There's only a little bit of bare rock. So yes, it's very vegetated. That green space is very important to us. There are also areas of continuous woodland. That is a separate measure because, as I've said, those are very big vertical things in the landscape. And so those are important in terms of the view. But in a British context, certainly, we have probably, millions of large individual trees forming field boundaries in our countryside view. So large individual trees, you can see them all over that landscape and the roaches along the edge of the fields. Those are also very important, so we would make particular note about those. If anyone doesn't know where that is, we are currently in that picture somewhere, almost. This is from Berry Hill Fields, looking down over the city of Stoke-on-Trent. So the built environment is actually complex, okay? Obviously, I've taken a picture here from the outside looking in at a city, and the VQI is actually designed for rural environments, but it illustrates what we mean about how would we assess how much built landscape there is. Is there any wooded? Well, there is a little bit. But what you don't really get from a photograph there is that there's lots of vertical infrastructure, so lots of mobile phone masts, there are lots of street lights, there are lots of big things sticking up in the landscape which we're not that impressed with. So the built space also has a whole range of things that we can measure and evaluate.
Something that's also really important is to consider historic and cultural features. As Ruth's mentioned, the UK is a managed landscape. People have been in it for centuries, thousands of years. And there are imprints of that on our environment. So, you would go to various places and find castles and forts and stone walls and cultural features. This image is Malcop. I suspect most of you know where it is. Our eye in that image is drawn to the folly, isn't it? It sits there astride its rugged terrain, looking out over the area around. I have a different reaction to that as somebody who wasn't brought up in Stoke-on-Trent, to Ruth. Ruth, how does this make you feel?
This has a lot of personal meaning for me. I grew up about less than a mile away from this particular folly. And so many childhood picnics, I must have been up there hundreds of times. It has formed part of my view for, over 50 years. It's very important to me as a landscape feature. And I also worked in the Cheshire View pub, just over the hill from there, if any of you know that much lamented Marston's pub that's no longer open.
A similar folly in the north of Leicestershire is of significant importance to me, Old John in Braggart Park. So we both have our follies.
The point is, I might rate that landscape more highly than Fiona.
I think you did, actually.
Did I? Yeah, I think I did, because it has a lot of personal meaning to me. So, yes.
So what do we think about that?
Right, hands up who likes it? Oh, well done. Anybody really think that's dreadful? Oh, we've got a very partisan audience, we love it.
But this makes a point. Perhaps because we know what it is, we might rate it in a different way to some other piece of industrial infrastructure, shall we say, or, sort of blot on the landscape or valued historic structure. That's something to think about for us, isn't it? And our relationship with those things. So, we've gone through this process, well, Ruth went through this process of developing a research tool. We then started talking. This must have been 2015-ish, something like that. Like I said, we'd maintained our separate research directions. Ruth started saying, well, I've developed this, it's successful, I've published on it, it worked, but that was developed for the Welsh landscape. A key thing in science is being able to replicate your methods and to try to transfer them and adapt them to somewhere else. So me having worked in Iceland, Ruth having wanted to go to Iceland, we decided that this landscape would be a perfect test of an adaptation to the Visual Quality Index. So this is a different landscape. It's different for a variety of reasons. It's very youthful. Iceland's geologically not very old at all. It's got volcanic processes, it has ice. That basically means it's subject to quite a lot of what we would call geomorphic change, so Earth surface processes. Interestingly also, Iceland is, I was going to say victim of burgeoning tourism. For the last 15 years, tourism has really taken off in Iceland, and they're having to manage that quite carefully. And sometimes, as we know, that's not always easy. There's also infrastructure for power and industry that's going up in Iceland at pace. And again, the adaptations and alterations to the environment are many and varied. And then, I don't know if you can see at the bottom here, that's actually myself and Ruth, stood in this field of what look like beautiful flowers.
Can I just say that the matching clothes were a complete accident?
There's another one of those in a minute, isn't there? Matching clothes, how do we do it? So these are actually Alaskan lupins, and they are an invasive species. They were brought in to stabilise the shifting sands in Iceland, to try to knit the ground together, but they've really run riot out there. And now, you know, in the summer, you look and you see this beautiful sort of carpet of purpley blue flowers, but actually, in terms of a landscape view, it's a monoculture, isn't it?
Yeah, so entertainingly, as we were being, it was probably my husband Dan who took that photograph of me and Fiona in those lupins. Busloads of people were stopping. Loads of tourists were getting out going, oh, marvellous, click, 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 click. What me and Fiona were actually discussing there was, oh my God, this is an ecological catastrophe. Isn't it dreadful? So there you go, but that's just because our view was different from theirs.
So we went through the process of thinking through how we'd do this. We went out into the field and we visited sites, more of which in a moment. This is a purely indulgent slide just to show you some of the spectacular lands. We actually stayed in that little house. That's Ruth letting herself in. Spectacular environments that we visited whilst we were out there, all part of the research, obviously. Getting to know our landscape. Well, not for me, but showing my colleague and friend this landscape. Now, there is a sort of tale behind the indicative and characteristic landscapes of the two places. So what we're going to do just for a moment is to try to point out some of the features that are in common and some of the features that differ slightly. So yes, in the first image in A there, that's actually Iceland. That's lowland Iceland. It has a few small trees. It's farmed. The field boundaries are rather thin and loose. But you can observe some similarities, I think, with the lowland landscape of Wales. What's different, Ruth?
So in the top right, so we're looking at panel C here. So that's just kind of a typical bit of really quite nice lowland Wales, I have to say. When I say lowland, we're actually on the edge of the mountains there. So you can see that I think the first thing that perhaps jumps out to you is how much more vegetation there is. And that there are a lot of trees. We have things called hedgerows, which they certainly do not have in Iceland. You'll notice that we have got field boundaries, but they're often walls and hedgerows as opposed to the very, wire landscapes you'd get in, you just don't get those structures. A much busier landscape in Wales, I would say. So some similarities, there are we've got sheep. Have we got any sheep in that? I'm looking at the Icelandic one, seeing if we've got any livestock.
Horses.
Grazing horses. Whereas obviously Wales is stuffed full of sheep largely. But in the upland one, if you take over.
Yeah, the upland characteristics of Iceland are, again, similar but different. So we have the presence of glaciers and ice caps and the deglaciating landscape. What I mean by that is glaciers are retreating and they're leaving behind ample quantities of bare land. And often what we see in Iceland is this very sort of grey landscape as the glaciers are moving, but they're melting, but then we've not got the colonisation. That hasn't happened yet. So there's a lot of areas that are grey rather than green. We know that Wales was glaciated, but it's had 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years to adapt to that deglaciation. So the green has become much more apparent.
I think the other thing we should point out, in B and D, these are both summer photographs. Yeah. Okay, and of course the key thing that jumps out is perhaps the colour of that Icelandic landscape. We've got a lot of ice, we've got a lot of white in that, haven't we? Whereas obviously in the summer in the panel D in the bottom right, that's a very typical upland scene for Wales, where we do have lots of bare rock, but we obviously still have a lot of vegetation. We've still got conifer plantations, and there is one of our beloved cultural features of a dry stone wall, which, you know, they're common everywhere. But in that landscape that Fiona's just referred to in panel B, you know, these are wild landscapes. You know, you can look at big chunks of them and not see any fingerprints of people at all in those landscapes. But they are kind of connected. It's almost like this is the before and this is the long, long afters. Yes.
So we adapted this tool. There's a little bit of backtracking here. There's an image there in the top corner. That's Ed Jones, who we're delighted to see here tonight. Wave your hand, Ed. Let them see you. Ed was a student of ours, and we had him working alongside us as part of an undergraduate research assistantship. And he, of his own volition, decided to go out to Iceland before we visited and actually collected for us 16 sites, I think. So he took photographs of them in winter and then brought them back for us. Now we thought, this is above and beyond. Thank you, Ed. We need to go to those places as well as some of our own so that we can look at the seasonal differences as well as some of the other issues to do with the landscape. So I'm just going to do a very quick whiz through of that three examples of the colour palette, as we'll call it. On the left-hand side there's Ed's image. And on the right-hand side, there's our image. So Ed's image was taken in winter. Can you see the differences in colour there? It's a very brownish, whitish landscape in winter. By summertime, the same shot reveals some moving water, the fact that we can see the bare mountainsides because the snow has largely melted. And also, we can see that the landscape has come alive with vegetation. So once again, even, you know, the same place, seasonally different, gives us a different view and a different experience, I would say, as a consequence.
Oh, just go back briefly, Fiona. The other thing we should mention about that is that if you're an Icelander, that is a very significant location. Some of you may have been there, but, you know...
Thingvellir, it's called, Icelandic, site of the old Icelandic Parliament, and also the Mid-Atlantic Ocean spreading ridge.
Yeah, so geographically it's a type site, very key for us as geographers, but for Icelanders that is a very culturally significant location. Sorry, you may continue.
Thank you. This is also iconic. It's iconic for a different reason. It's a spectacular waterfall, Gullfoss. Ed's image there in winter makes it look slightly different. Was that cold? It's once again, it's sort of very monochrome, isn't it? We've got that the frozen waterfall, the white of the surround of the snow, and then an overcast day makes it look even more. You know, again, two colours really, grey and white. By the summertime, we have a different... We did go on a nice day, though, didn't we? If the cloud had been down, it wouldn't have looked like that. Spectacular environment with its... Again, with the green having come alive, the moving water, giving that sensation of, you know, it's spectacular stood there. We can't convey that through an image. If you're standing there, it's a completely different experience. This is a funny one. This is a lighthouse, and you can see Ed's shadow. He went on in really quite fine conditions, anticyclonic conditions. And you can see something white in the background. Beyond the lighthouse, there's this dome. That's an ice cap. We were stood there in the summer, weren't we, Ruth? And I was pointing up towards the sky and going, the ice cap's up there. Ruth just couldn't, she had no conception of that being there. again, the cloud had come right down, and we went for 2 or 3 days to another location where we couldn't see any ice at all. So it really is dependent. In big landscapes like this, the view is dependent on weather. Did it work, Ruth, this whole process of trying to adapt the VQI to Iceland?
Yes.
Satisfying tick.
We've skipped over a lot of stages in between there, so it was quite a rigorous process. But yes, it did. Essentially, I'm going to come over here just briefly, if I may. Essentially, what we've got is a whole series of things that are Icelandic specific, okay, variables that we needed to include, like snow, ice, geysers, hot mud, all those sort of landscape features in Iceland that were important, that we added in to that particular VQI. We've then got the Welsh ones I've talked about. There are a whole chunk in the middle that are common to those two landscapes. So we were able to adapt it, and hurrah, we published it. Tale of Two Landscapes, transferring landscape quality metrics from Wales to Iceland. And it's one of the first time anybody has actually done that, actually transferred a method summarising landscape from one landscape to a very different landscape, and proved it worked.
And matching clothes yet again.
And matching clothes yet again.
What next?
Okay. So we're very pleased about that. That was all marvellous. But now we've got the bit between our teeth. Now, we are academics and we love to do research, but obviously we're a university, and a big part of our role is education and, you know, working with our students. So we were very lucky in securing funding for a PhD. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to get a student to go to a completely different landscape, preferably somewhere in continental Europe, and to take this one step on. And we were absolutely incredibly lucky to get Daniela Jovanovska from Macedonia, as it was then, which is now North Macedonia, courtesy of the Greeks, but it's in the Balkans. And Daniela arrived in the UK to start her PhD, adapting the VQI further and refining it to this particular landscape. She was working in the Shara Mountains, so that's the mountain range you can see in the bottom left. It's the mountain range that separates North Macedonia from Kosovo. It's a fantastic mountain range. I've been there with Daniela. Really big mountains, spectacular scenery, but very unusual landscape because Macedonia is situated on crossroads. It's at the crossroad between sort of northern and southern Europe, but it's also in the crossroad between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Culturally, it's very interesting, and Fiona will say a bit more about that. But Daniela adapted the whole process. She then mapped the entire region using an adapted VQI for this particular Macedonian landscape, but also then took it another big step forward by thinking very much more about the kind of social cultural components of this, because we know that Macedonia is a cultural hotspot as well. It's a mix of Macedonian Greek Orthodox type communities, but it also has a very large Muslim community. It has an Albanian community. There are very, very, very different groups here. And she wanted to explore how their cultural familiarity with this landscape affected how they valued their landscapes.
So this big piece of work then, extensive field work, 179 sites in the mountains, but then 293 interviews with people across that cultural spectrum. So Daniela interviewed Macedonians, she interviewed Turkish people, she interviewed people from different religions, different ages, and found significant differences in what they valued in the landscape. Some of that's tied to what they do work-wise, but some of it very clearly is tied to cultural preferences amongst those peoples. Now, we won't go into all of the details here. It will be published soon, that aspect of the work. But it's really important that we bear these things in mind, because when we're looking to manage locations, the people that visit those locations, the people that inhabit those locations, if we know what their preferences are, then we can think about the ways in which we manage environments to take account of those preferences. So this is actually pioneering work. It's the first study from North Macedonia of this type, and it's also the first study to do it on this scale. We're very, very proud of Daniela, as you can tell from that image at the top there.
I'm not going to dwell on this because we're a bit short of time, but I've also had a whole load of fantastic interns from the Basque Country in the northwest of Spain, and we have just finished, again, adapting this approach to those very different landscapes of the Basque Country. It has to be tweaked each time. And the key thing is, when you're doing landscape work, a method must be culturally embedded, and you need people who live in those landscapes to do it. I can't go and assess the Basque Country in the same way that people who are Basque think about that landscape. So I'm just about to submit this for publication. That's the first visual quality map of the Basque Country. I haven't got time to go into it, so we're going to skip on. But
likewise, New Zealand is another story. I was fortunate enough to be part of a research expedition to New Zealand in 2018. Never want to go somewhere like that lightly, thinking about my footprint, my carbon footprint particularly. Then I decided that as well as do all the other things that I was doing out there, I would do a test of the VQI2. We adapted the VQI to the New Zealand landscape, and we will again be working on that, as well as one or two other areas that we've translated it to.
Okay, so from the sublime to the small and not ridiculous. Okay, so obviously we've got those really big landscapes. Okay, we know we've got those fantastic big places. But I'd like to introduce another student of ours who also is in the audience tonight, Anne Brown, who is our MPhil student, just finished. And Anne has a very interesting view on this, because Anne, you are originally Australian born and bred, and Anne moved to this country and has been living in Barlaston, is that right? Yeah, for sort of 30 odd years or something around there. You've been in Britain for a long time. And Anne found about our work and was very interested to see if it could be adapted to kind of ordinary landscapes. And Anne took the work that we've done and took it in a slightly different way to focus on the Downs Banks area. I don't know if any of you have been to Downs Banks, the National Trust site. So as you know, it's a very nice, very highly valued site by its local population. It's not spectacular, it's not, you know, the Cairngorms, but it's a very well loved and heavily visited site. And Anne did another very interesting piece of work looking very much at the seasons at this landscape. So Anne did a whole series of sites on this site, looking at all the 4 seasons to see how these different changes in the landscape affect the visual quality index and how we can incorporate that kind of temporal dynamic of the landscape in these measures. Again, another really successful piece of work, and we're looking forward to seeing Anne graduate in the summer. So that's another one. Tick.
What we've also done is make a decision that, as well as having a tool for use in research, we should also try and think about how we can incorporate this into education. Now, we've used the VQI with our undergraduate students, but one of the things we've done relatively recently is start engaging younger people in landscape quality. And again, add an Anne and Ed feature as part of this work. Ed was employed by the Field Studies Council. Anne is a former geography teacher, and they both had skills that they could bring to this. What we did through working with the Field Studies Council and local schools is engage people in the VQI. By engaging people, I mean young people, school children, and we developed a package that could be used by teachers and students to make them see the landscape in a different way, I guess. There's a sort of a sense of trying to encourage pride in local landscapes, to raise aspirations. And it's also designed to tackle this rather nebulous concept of place, which is quite difficult in A-level geography. So we put together this package. For us, it was about the collaboration and the connection and trying to sort of mentor and talent spot. But we've put together this package and submitted it for publication. As part of that process, then some of the comments that we have, I looked more at the area in more depth and was able to judge it better, that kind of thing. We can come back to this if anyone's got questions about it, but we need to zip on because the audience participation side of this talk awaits. Now you see it, now we don't. We started with this image. We are thinking a lot about climate change at the moment, and it has very many different impacts. What we're concerned with the VQI are the visual impacts that it has on particular landscapes. It changes the terrain, it changes obviously, as we've seen, water, snow, ice, vegetation, the colours in the landscape, the seasonal view, and it also changes the built environment as we have to adapt to climate change. So this is something that myself and Ruth are thinking very hard about at the moment, and also considering the next sort of avenues of exploration for the visual quality index.
Okay, so this was probably my toughest gig. Hanley, on a Saturday afternoon, I took part in Soapbox Science, which is a great thing where women scientists get out into the public and we talk about our science. And there I am in July. Yeah, it was July. So we're going to introduce you. As I said, I'd just like to say in my defence, I am a very techie person. I've done lots of really techie, complicated things with computers. But my favourite piece of research kit that I have ever used is my designed and beautifully built.
Be very careful when we take this off. Oops.
Oops.
Oh, can we get the top? I'm not tall enough.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce you to the Scenics Wingometer. So who doesn't want one of these? And a big thank you to my husband for rolling his eyes and building it for me when I asked him. Okay, so here I am with it. And how this works is, effectively, in that Welsh VQI, I was asking people to rate landscapes. They were doing it on an online questionnaire and using slidey bars between 0 and 10. And I needed something a bit more interactive than that. So essentially, we had the Scenics Wingometer. So how does it work? Very technical, okay? Okay, this is your scale, okay? So we're going 1 to 10, okay? You can have a look on the other screens if you can't quite see it. I'm sure you can kind of get the general hang of it. So you are going to do some landscape evaluation, okay? So we're going to give you some images and we want you to shout out on a scale of 1 to 10 how beautiful or inspiring the landscape we show you is to you personally. And we'll see if we can get some kind of idea. So
are we ready?
We're ready. Are you ready? Yep. Okay, right, let's go for it. Okay, number 1. Woo! Anybody else at the back? Any other concept, you know? Bit lower, okay, but are we up in this kind of top quarter? Are we quite pleased with this up here? Okay. oh, windy. Come on, it's got to be more than a 7 out of 10. I'm going to hover up here. I think we can agree most people seem to like that landscape, and when we asked people, they did. Next one.
That's my team's backdrop, in case you were in any doubt. There we go. What about this one?
Yes, it's the weather. 4. Ooh. Oh.
It is.
Oh, shut up. Don't complicate it, Al.
It is. We're manipulating you, Al. You know it. Yes. So this is the kind of environment that you will see in Iceland as glaciers disappear. I guess that's the point. The previous one is the kind of environment you'll also see when glaciers disappear, but we know which one of those two we prefer. What about that one? Does anybody know where it is? Anybody know where it is? It's in the Peak District. Yeah. It's back Tor and Hollands Cross. It's viewed from near Castleton, basically, in the peaks. Yeah. Does that?
What are we looking at? Can we have some more numbers thrown out, please? Ooh. Oh, we're quite liking that one. Quite like that one. Yeah, very nice, very nice. We're hovering here. Okay. Five. Ooh. Ooh, people are not enjoying that, are you? Very, very typical bit of Wales, that. Does anyone recognise where this is? Chatterley-Whitfield. Yeah, it is. You're looking at Chatterley-Whitfield. What do we reckon, ladies and gentlemen? Ooh, okay. Chatterley-Whitfield trumps an Icelandic glacier then. Liking your style, liking your style.
Okay.
Very nice. Next one.
Is there an 11?
We're available for bar mitzvahs and weddings. Yes, in good Spinal Tap style for those of you over the age of about 35. It does go up to 11. No, that's just a joke.
And also, on the other side.
Yeah. There is a point about that, though, because obviously the very first thing we showed you and some of those other landscapes, you're like, woo, yeah, confident, 9, 10. And then we show you this and like, ooh, right, okay, we might need to readjust.
Yeah. So what happened to me in New Zealand, we kept going to ever more beautiful places and we'd already scored them, the maximum score. There is this point that it's all relative, isn't it? Sometimes, perhaps when you're on holidays, you get that experience. Something's better than you thought it was going to be.
So we are nearly done.
We're nearly done.
We can just bear with us for a few more minutes. Now, you'll be delighted to know I'm not going to talk through this in detail, but what this actually represents is myself and Fee sitting down and looking back over kind of 10 years worth of work and trying to map how that original Glasteer project, it was called Glasteer, the Welsh project I got, then led to this research conversation. Research is not linear, generally, for most people. And all these other things in here have come out of our collaboration. So I could have just stuck with my stuff, and that would have been interesting. But by collaborating with Fiona, we took it in a completely different place. We involved people like the Field Studies Council through Ed. We pulled in other MPhil students. We then went on from Anne and Ed's work to develop all that educational work that was never in my mind when I first created the method. We're conquering the world in terms of our sites. There are publications that have obviously come out of that, but there are many other students we haven't mentioned here that we've trained in the field, we've taken on field work, they've gone on to use it in their own projects. And so this is just a small part of how that story of a research collaboration between people from different ends of a discipline leads to something much better. So I think...
A few people that have been involved along the way. We've introduced ourselves. Anne and Ed are here. Daniela can't be here. She's back in North Macedonia. And two Basque interns, Anne and Arati, who helped Ruth in particular develop some of the work that was done in the Basque Country. Never one to miss an opportunity. We have a new undergraduate degree here at Staffordshire University, Geography, Climate Change and Society. It's a BSc. It's launching as of September. Geography is a fantastic subject. It's very much at the heart of what's happening at the moment. It holds up a mirror to the world. Most significant issues in the world have a geographical dimension. If you know of friends who would be interested, recommend us. Go and have a look at what the course contains. Plug over. We'll stop there. Thank you to our...
Get in, 3 minutes to 7. You'll be relieved because when we ran through this, we took about 2.25 hours. So yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.